President Trump set to name Rich Clarida vice chair of the Fed. This is according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal. And another appointment potentially today as well, Michelle Bowman to the Fed Board of Governors. For more, I want to bring in international economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee, with the caveat, Michael, that this is Wall Street Journal reporting.
No, we've matched.
We have matched.
We have matched it, so we now know. Bloomberg is also reporting that Rich Clarida, who is a Columbia University professor, was once in charge of the economics department there, rotated out of that, but is also a vice chairman at PIMCO, has worked for them a long time, is going to be the new vice chair of the Fed. At least he's being nominated by the president today, we understand. Now,
obviously, there were some good candidates out there, right? We were reporting on several great candidates, but Rich Clarida's expertise is international monetary policy. That's his entire background. He's a specialist on things like the Japan crisis and many other international.
Well, actually, his basic background is in dynamic stochastic modeling, and you don't want to get into that if you don't have to. But basically, he's a modeling expert, and he is somebody who has a deep expertise in what models tell you and how they can be adjusted, and that is something that Jay Powell doesn't have. Powell, of course, comes to the Fed chairmanship as a former investment banker. He understands the markets, but he doesn't understand the deep econometrics, and Rich Clarida is going to bring that to him.
And of course, we have John Williams also, who is expected to take over the New York Fed. So this leadership trio of the three of them with Mr. Powell, how would that work?
Well, the two who run the Board of Governors, Rich Clarida and Jay Powell, are basically in charge of overall policy. John Williams will be an important contributor as the head of the New York Fed because he has a permanent vote on the Open Market Committee, and he's also an intellectual heavyweight in terms of the Fed. So the chairman now has probably less monetary policy experience than we've seen in many decades, but he has two of the strongest backups that we've seen in a long time.
So, Michael, handicap Rich Clarida for us. If you were to talk about economic bias, if there is such a thing, where would he come on a spectrum?
You'd put him sort of in the middle. Rich did work for the George Bush administration as the Treasury Department's chief economist, but he's better known as a sort of pragmatist rather than an ideologue. He isn't firmly in one camp or the other. He looks at what's best for the overall economy and through the filter of modeling. So that is, a little bit less ideological than some who come at the economy from the point of view of whether taxes or whether spending or those sorts of things are the best policies to pursue.
And we have heard in the past that Mr. Williams, John Williams, right now the current president of the San Francisco Fed, and also Mr. Clarida have been on the same path when it comes to the view that rates could remain stuck at relatively low levels. Do we know anything else about his monetary policy views?
He's generally a centrist there as well, would look to keep inflation under control, but not doctrinaire about it, not somebody who's going to be on the hard hawk wing of the Fed. He does believe to a certain extent, as John Williams does, that the neutral rate has come down, the rate at which you are neither stimulating nor retarding the economy, and that's come down in recent years. We don't know exactly where it is, but it means that the Fed doesn't have to go as far to tighten the economy as it did in the past.
Well, before he went quiet, as did some of the other candidates, he was on with us on the European Toes back in December. I'm just going to get that in. Have people look at one of his final interviews, because we won't be hearing from him probably until there's an official Fed speech now, assuming that the nomination goes all well and everything. And there'll be, I guess, nomination hearings, right?
Well, in theory, you won't hear from him until his confirmation hearing, and we'll have to see when that is scheduled. And remember, we have Marvin Goodfriend, who had a confirmation hearing, and his nomination just seems to have stalled in the Senate to be a Fed board governor. So we don't know exactly what the timing is going to be. Goodfriend had some issues in terms of his confirmation. He didn't perform well at his confirmation hearing, and we don't know whether they're just holding it up because they're not expecting him to pass, or whether the Senate has some real problem with him, or if they just can't get around to a vote with everything that's going on. And the same thing is going to be true of Rich. Now, we don't know that there's any problem with his nomination, but the Senate hasn't been moving very fast on these things, except when they have to.
We didn't get any question about Michelle Bowman, so let's just throw one in. Who is she? Where does she come from?
Community banker from Kansas. The Fed has a seat that is traditionally reserved for community bankers, and it's been hard to find somebody because the overall Fed you don't make as much money as you do necessarily as a banker, and you don't have as much influence when you're a community banker, but it is an important post to bring the views of smaller banks into the Board of Governors.